Okay, so I graduated from Dallas International University last year, May of 2025, and this was my master's thesis for graduation. If you are interested in reading the full paper, you can actually access that through DIU's website. But this presentation will be covering the major findings. It won't be covering all the findings because it's too much. The title is Differences Between Oral and Written Translation, a case study on Jonah. And so to begin, I want to kind of give a little bit of the historical context that this thesis is responding to. So back in the 80s, Jesuit priest named Walter Ong published his book, Orality and Literacy, The Technologizing of the Word. And in here, he establishes a spectrum with oral style of language and written style of language as two opposite poles. And so this spectrum is then applied to anthropological and cognitive theories on societies and cultures concerning logic and concrete/abstract thought. And it typifies cognitive features that manifest through language of primary oral and literate societies. And so Ong describes the oral mode of thinking as situational and written as abstract. Oral is aggregative and written analyzes. Oral is traditional, empathetic, and participatory, whereas written is objective and distant. And he describes the stylistic features of oral language as additive, context-bound, repetitive/redundant, and formulaic. And Ong's work has had a very big impact on the discussion. Even nowadays, with oral Bible translation, he is often cited and referenced. But the conversation has evolved, and the next major person of discussion that this thesis owes a lot to is Douglas Biber, who argues from his work in 1991, Variation Across Speech and Writing, that a lot of Ong's characterization of primary oral and literate societies are overgeneralized dichotomies, and that many of these features that Ong observed and then posits can be explained through genre conventions. So Biber uses factor analysis to analyze large corpora of texts in English. And through this analysis, he found that there wasn't any sort of clear differences between the oral and written along parameters such as situation versus abstract content. So Biber is arguing that genre is more of the driving factor between differences along such parameters. And so that's the context that this thesis is building off of. Orality studies started off as this extreme characterization of the written and oral as two opposite poles. However, the conversation has since evolved to suggest that orality and versus the written word is more complex, and that you really can't ignore genre when talking about it. But still, when we talk about oral Bible translation, everyone has sort of this innate intuition that they are different. We just don't really know how they're different. And so that's what this thesis is trying to address with the research question, or at least begin to address, is what are the differences between an orally produced and communicated translated text and the same translated text that's written down. And so to address this need for empirical analysis, I conducted a comparative analysis of the book of Jonah from two well-respected written translations, the New English Translation, or the NET, and the New Living Translation, as well against an oral translation known as the Spoken English Bible, the SEB. And so the purpose of this thesis is to contribute to the larger academic discussion on orality by analyzing the differences between an orally crafted translation and two written translations of the same text. Before I go into the findings, it's good to address some terminology. When most people think about oral and written, they're thinking about them as media, the physical means of transmission. Oral is spoken, written is physically written down on paper. However, when we are, for the purpose of this thesis and this analysis, we need to look at the oral and the written as modes in order to account for something like an audio Bible versus an oral Bible. Audio Bible is originally written and it's designed to be read, but then it's later recorded in spoken voice, whereas an oral Bible translation undergoes a very different process where it hasn't been written, is not memorized, and is deliberately crafted for an oral delivery. The other term we need to address is prosody. And here, prosody are paralinguistic features of sound that are not present and cannot be communicated through text. So, for example, loudness, pitch, utterance duration, vocal quality. And so when we're talking about the oral, we need to keep in mind that there's two channels that we are accessing. We're accessing the linguistic channel, which the written also has access to, but then we are also accessing a paralinguistic channel, which is the prosodic channel. And this channel, the written does not have access to. So prosody is exclusively an oral feature. The scope is the Book of Jonah in the Spoken English Bible, the NLT as our representative for a dynamic equivalence translation, and the NET, which is our representation of a formal equivalence written translation. We are sticking to the genre of narrative. And so as a result, we are not addressing chapter 2 of Jonah because that's poetry. Also, because this analysis is more concerned with the Spoken English Bible, we will not be addressing the verse of Jonah being swallowed by the fish, because in the Spoken English Bible recordings, they interpret that verse as chapter 2, verse 1. So regarding how this analysis was done, it was done in 3 parts. There's a data analysis, a qualitative analysis, and prosodic analyses. So the data analysis is looking at quantitative values of features presence. It's important to note that this is not a statistical analysis. This is sort of a very brief look at just some of trends that are appearing in the numbers. The qualitative analysis is a side-by-side comparison of all 3 versions together to, again, see any sort of trends or patterns. And the prosodic analysis are occasional analyses of acoustic data on certain features that arise in the data analysis and the qualitative analysis as significant. So prosodic analyses are interspersed between the data and the qualitative analysis. It's not its own section because prosody is quite a deep field on its own. And this could have been a whole nother thesis on its own to do a full prosodic analysis. That would have been way too much. So it's just some small ones. And even then, the prosodic analyses are quite shallow or superficial. They don't go super in depth. It's, again, just to see some of the patterns and trends. Another thing to address for the prosodic analyses is that texts of the Spoken English Bible are provided, including punctuation, but this transcription was done by me personally, based on my own subjective hearing of the audio recording. And regarding the prosodic analysis, it's mainly looking at waveform diagrams, measuring relative amplitude for loudness, and frequency lines measured in hertz for pitch. It also measures some duration of the utterances, the pauses, and the pacing in seconds to the centisecond. But not included in the prosodic analysis are any discussions regarding formant spectrographs and F0. So the major findings. When conducting this analysis, there are 2 major tendencies that arose to summarize more of the significant findings. The first one is that the SEB is longer. This is something that was immediately apparent from the beginning of the data analysis. It's longer in word count, longer in the number of clauses. It has more of something I call clause initial conjuncts, which I will address more in a second. And generally speaking, it does tend to explicate more. The SEB, the second major trend, is that the SEB prioritizes prosody to communicate emotional content. And this is apparent in how it uses quotatives, the occurrence of or lack thereof linguistically coded emotional content, the types of explication that it will do, and especially how it creates rhetorical questions. So looking at some of the data analysis here, we'll address the length first. So here are the different chapters, chapter 1, chapter 3, chapter 4, side by side, and the totals. When we look at the word count, the NET and the NLT stay within a 2 to 20 word difference range of each other with each chapter, whereas the SEB will differ anywhere between 30 to 60 words per chapter in comparison to the other two. And so as a result, in total, the SEB has 120 to 150 more words than the NET and the NLT, whereas the NET and the NLT only have a word count difference of 28 between each other. And a lot of this higher word count is attributed to right here, these clause initial conjuncts. So what is a clause initial conjunct? Well, so there's phrasal conjuncts or conjunctions. So for example, that will connect elements of a phrase. So for example, every person and animal. You can't take out that and without and still maintain grammatical integrity. It's necessary. Clausal conjuncts, in comparison, loosely connect two independent clauses together. So for example, Jonah, get up and go to the great city of Nineveh and announce my judgment against them. In this example, we could take out both of those ands, and the clauses would simply transform into their own individual sentences. So Jonah, get up, go to the great city of Nineveh, announce my judgment against them. The and is grammatically optional. And so as you can see here with the clause initial conjuncts, there's quite a larger, more amount of them in the SEB. 39% of clauses in the SEB begin with a conjunct compared to 29% in the NLT and 24% in the NET. And so when I looked at this in a prosodic analysis, it was found that clause initial conjuncts are prosodically motivated to fill sort of an introductory period leading up into the utterance. And then when we go up to clause number, we do see that the SEB is longer with clauses as well. So the NET and NLT only differ between each other across chapters within 4 clauses, whereas the SEB between chapters will have anywhere between 9 to 17 more clauses, and then in total 36 more clauses than the NET or the NLT. And so as a result, what you're getting is that the SEB is distributing the same content across more clause structures. And that might also be it might also be adding to this higher word count, because when you have more clauses, you have more function words that are grammatically required. Regarding explication, explication is an often discussed feature of orality, in that most scholars typically assume that the oral explicates more than the written. And in general terms, this analysis does find that to be true, but I did look at explication more in depth. And so this is not always true. There are different motivations that are driving explication. And so here in the very beginning, we see a clear example where there's more explication going on. NET and NLT have a very comparable introduction to Jonah, whereas the SEB takes more time to introduce Jonah the person, that he's a messenger, he's the son of this guy, and then it goes into God talking to Jonah. However, when we go into different motivations between regarding explication, we do see a different pattern. So the SEB does explicate more during the introduction of a chapter, a new character, a new setting, or the beginning of an extended quote. And so this explication of introductions can trigger reordering within the verse that's not present in the other two versions. But in contrast to this, the SEB also shows the opposite tendency for the conclusion of a chapter or a quote, with the exception of chapter 4. And it will remove additional details provided in the NET and NLT. And we see this here at the end of the King of Nineveh's address. Both the NET and NLT talk about God changing his mind, turning from his anger so that people won't die. SEB keeps this quite concise, saying that just God will have compassion and not destroy. Also, repetition is a commonly discussed feature of orality, in that if you ever when you see it come up, people are mostly talking about the oral is more repetitive. And so throughout this analysis, the SEB has shown that this claim is not as straightforward as it appears. It does show increased repetition, especially for emphatic purposes. However, there are times when the SEB has removed instances of repetition that are present in the NET and the NLT. So up here we have a typical example of repetition that was supplied, is that the sailors are trying to row back to shore. Here the SEB repeats the rowing part for an emphatic purpose. But here, when we get to verse 3 in chapter 1, we have this repeated mention of Tarshish. The NET mentions Tarshish 3 times. The NLT mentions it twice, but here in the SEB, well, first they don't say Tarshish, they say Spain, but they only talk about Spain once. They don't repeat it at all. And there's not super confident regarding the motivation as far as why they remove this repetitive mention of the location name. But when I spoke with some of the people working on the SEB, an informal explanation that was offered to me was that this could be because, at least in English, repetition sort of serves an emphatic purpose. And so to repeat information that's not deemed salient, so in this case, the location name, that would be unduly emphasizing and drawing attention to information that's really not supposed to be that prominent. Now, when we are talking about the emotional content, the most clear sort of data that kind of came up was regarding the quotatives. There's a general tendency for the SEB to avoid linguistic emotional coding, and this is very strongly shown in that the SEB exclusively uses the word said when introducing a quote. The only time when it doesn't use the word said is that it doesn't even use a quotative at all. It goes straight into the quote. This is compared to the NLT, which only uses the word said 3 times, and then really likes to use other types of quotatives. And then even the NET, which does prefer the word said, will sometimes use another quotative. This is probably because the NET is a more formal equivalent, so it's probably trying to be more faithful to the Hebrew quotative formula of using the word said. But even then, they do use 2 other quotatives, whereas the SEB does not want to use anything other than said. And the motivation behind this is, the fact that you have access to that prosodic channel. The NLT really depends on the quotative to color the emotions of the speaker, whereas the SEB doesn't need to use that. It has access to the voice, and so you don't need to say that the captain shouted at Jonah. you can just go into the quote and use your voice to show that the captain is shouting at Jonah. And so the SEB is relying more on prosody to communicate these emotions. And so regarding emotional coding, these are the different ways of linguistically coding emotions that I looked at. And the only feature in which the SEB stands out using more in comparison to the other two is emphatic repetition, which we discussed earlier. But regarding everything else and looking at it all in total, the SEB actually scores slightly lower than both the NET and the NLT in the percentage of emotionally coded linguistic features. So it's only 11% of the text is emotionally coded. The NLT is 14% emotionally coded, and the NET is about 12% emotionally coded. So this is likely due to the fact that prosody is carrying more of the emotional communicative burden. And as a result, the actual text and the linguistics of the SEB is slightly less coded for emotions. Going back to explication regarding emotional content, there's a direct contrast between the written and the oral of how they are framing the same information. And what you see is that the SEB will explicate sort of the character's mental states, their internal assumptions and intentions. And so here we have a supplied explication. Sailors did not want to do that. That's not present in the NET and the NLT. It's heavily implied, but the SEB will outright directly say that. But here in verse 5, we have a direct contrast of how they're framing what's going on. The SEB does not like explicating emotional content. It would rather explicate mental state. So the NET and the NLT names the emotion. It says the sailors were afraid, or that they have fear and that they're desperate. SEB just says they didn't know what to do, and the emotion is implied. Another way that this strongly comes up is also rhetorical questions. And rhetorical questions in and of themselves are an interesting feature to compare because they draw so much attention to themselves. And so the NET and the NLT will use rhetorical questions for emotional effect. And we see this here in verse 10. This, what have you done? Why did you do it? They're not waiting for Jonah to answer. This is purely a rhetorical question to show the emotions of the sailors. But here we have the SEB removing this rhetorical question because this verse is not in the peak of chapter 1. And the SEB even goes so far to actually, this is the only time the SEB does this, but it breaks the verse boundary because we see this question come up here 2 verses prior, this what have you done? And this is in the string of questions that the sailors are asking Jonah. Who are you? What is your job? Where do you come from? This is a string of literal questions. They want him to answer. They want him to respond. And so by moving the rhetorical question from verse 10 up to verse 8, it's reframing this question from rhetorical into literal. But then when we talk about peak verses, the SEB is fine with rhetorical questions. So going back to the king of Nineveh's final remarks in his address, he has this rhetorical question, who knows, who can tell, who knows? The SEB keeps this here. This is a peak verse in chapter 3. And then in the very last verse of the book, in chapter 4, not only is this sort of the peak of chapter 4, this is arguably the peak of the whole book. It actually repeats the rhetorical question, most likely to emphasize the larger thematic message of the book of Jonah. Shouldn't God care about these people? So most evidence in this study points to larger motivation that prosody is used for carrying emotional content in the SEB, and that the linguistic channel of an oral text in English, contains less emotional information, but instead prioritizes content such as discourse features, especially peak features. Prosodic motivations will result in lexical and grammatical variations in the text, such as a greater appearance of clause initial conjuncts. And these findings suggest that the paralinguistic channel of prosody accounts for many of the variations that you would find between oral and written language. This study also indicates that, in general, regarding English, orature tends to be longer in length, both in word count and in clause count. And so this was my master's thesis, and so there's a lot more in this analysis that I wasn't able to cover in this presentation. This presentation mainly covers the most prominent findings. Other findings that weren't addressed in this presentation include the oral version containing less diversity in verbs, a less formal register than the written, with a greater presence of contractions, preference for more generic terms, and prioritization of naturalness. So with this in mind, we'll move on to the question section, and I'm happy to address any questions or comments.